Thank you. For the sake of time, I'm going to start. So this paper is a kind of theoretical exercise. We wanted to see if Qatar's LNG emissions have had any kind of positive impact in the past, and does the argument that LNG can be a transition fuel kind of stick? And Qatar was an interesting case study because of its export market. So just some background, Qatar is the either first or second exporter of LNG to the world. And its main export markets are in Asia, so Japan, South Korea, China, and India. And the interesting thing about Qatar's export market is that they have very large industrial sectors. So on average, industry share of GDP for these countries between 2016 and 2020 was 32%. In comparison, for the same period, the UK's was around 14 or 15%. So the idea was that we came up with a hypothetical scenario, and we thought, what if Qatar's LNG production kind of disappeared overnight between 2005 and 2020? How would it have been replaced? And how much more CO2 would have been emitted by the fuels replacing Qatar's LNG? Or put differently, what are the emission reductions due to Qatar's LNG exports replacing dirtier fuels between 2005 and 2020? So we made some assumptions. We assumed that the decarbonization of industry in these export markets in that period is unlikely to have happened to a significant degree. We also assumed that the CO2 emissions of the different fuels, including LNG, are limited to end-use emissions, and that had Qatar's exports of LNG disappeared during that period, it's unlikely they would have been replaced by its competitors. And so what we used is mostly IEA data and data from Climate Watch for CO2 emissions and IEA natural gas information. And what we found was that, so what we did was we created several scenarios. We had a scenario where all of Qatar's LNG that disappeared from the energy mixes of those countries or its export markets was replaced by coal. And we had another scenario where all of the old LNG was replaced by the existing fuels in the energy mix proportional to their existing share. So LNG being replaced by coal obviously is the upper bound. So basically that's the biggest difference between the two, in CO2 emissions between LNG and coal. And then the lower bound is Qatar's LNG being replaced by all fuels proportional. And I'm going to get questions why there was not a scenario for Qatar's LNG being replaced by renewables, and we can get to that later. So basically, in this graph, you'll see that so Qatar's total CO2 emissions is the dotted line in red. Its total greenhouse gas emissions is the solid red line, and the dark blue line at the top is the upper bound. So had all of Qatar's LNG been replaced by coal, or if Qatar's LNG exports purely replaced coal, this is how much CO2 would have been offset by those LNG exports. And as you can see, between 2010 and 2012, that overlap means that for those two periods, Qatar would have been carbon negative, right? And obviously, Qatar's LNG would not have been replaced purely by coal. So what we did, we created a most likely scenario. And in this most likely scenario, we still find a peak around 2011, which was the post global economic crisis recovery. And then after 2011, the amount of CO2 that is offset by Qatar's LNG exports by replacing dirtier fuels decreases all the way to 2020. But on average, what we find is that between 2005 and 2020, Qatar's LNG exports to its major export markets or to the world, on average, offset around 40% of Qatar's own emissions. And the total that we calculated between 2005 and 2020 is that the total reduction CO2 emissions by Qatar exporting LNG was around 600 million tons of CO2, which is a significant amount. It's 4.5 times Kuwait's annual GHG emissions, or 1.5 times the UK's annual GHG emissions. And then we did a projection on what the potential for this reduction will be like in the future. And we made a couple of assumptions about what the future is going to be like. The major assumptions were that there's going to be a slowdown in growth of coal consumption, an increase in gas consumption, and then obviously increase in renewables. And we assume that Qatar's CO2 emissions trajectory continues between 2020 and 2040. And this is what we found. And you can see that post 2020, the amount of reductions in CO2 emissions due to Qatar's LNG exports decreases significantly. So it borders the bottom, the lower bound. And even if you look at the best case scenario, so even if from 2020 onwards, Qatar's LNG only replaces coal, which is the dirtiest fuel, which is ideally what you would like, then there's still a growing gap. There would be a growing gap if Qatar's CO2 emissions increased business as usual. And why is this important? I mean, a lot of you might think, so what? Is this Qatar kind of flexing? Can Qatar use this argument to kind of flex its muscles? To say that, well, in the past, we reduced emissions and we were almost kind of carbon neutral in 2011. Well, not really. So the interesting thing about this exercise is that if you look at the past and think, well, LNG exports allowed Qatar to, contribute to global reductions in CO2 emissions. In the future, it won't be able to do that anymore, right? Because there's going to be less coal consumption. And if there's no coal being consumed, then LNG exports will just be contributing more CO2 emissions as opposed to offsetting. So what you can do about that in order to maintain that 40% that was, the 40% offsets of local emissions between 2005 and 2020, to maintain that going to the future is you have a couple of options. You either lower your emissions locally, which Qatar is planning to do through decarbonizing its LNG production process, or you have a more targeted kind of LNG export strategy where you only export, or you prefer to export to countries where coal is a dominant fuel, or you invest in renewable energy development elsewhere, where there's in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a need for increases in electricity access, and you can a lot of the money can be invested in developing renewable energy technologies, or even being involved in climate finance. There's a lot of talk now of countries, high income countries, resource-rich countries investing a lot of the windfall from the 2022 increases in oil prices to underwrite the climate finance requirements for adaptation and mitigation measures to 2040 and 2050. So there are a couple of options that can be done, but the idea is that there is a way to kind of play a kind of responsible role globally. This exercise is specific to LNG because it's the difference between LNG emissions and coal emissions is significant. But it provides a couple of options for the country or any other LNG exporters, and this is what we hope to do in the next phase of this project, is to look at the likely kind of strategy that Qatar can adopt in order to remain a responsible global player. And mainly the reason that we need to think about these things is that it's unlikely that LNG reductions due to LNG substitution, they're unlikely to peak again like they did in 2011, because the world is moving away from coal, despite coal being persistent, but there is a move away from coal. And then potential scenarios that can be looked at are, so I use Norway, Singapore, and the US. Norway and Singapore, because they have, there are similar characteristics with Qatar. Norway is small. Singapore is small. Norway has a lot of resources and a small population. And then there's also the U.S. scenario, because the U.S. it's considered a high CO2 emitting country, but in order to to basically have emissions similar to those countries, Qatar needs to reduce its emissions significantly by 2040. But there are ways of doing that, whether it's the current strategy that Qatar has adopted, which is reducing the emissions in the LNG production process, or energy efficiency, which we talked about extensively yesterday, or some of the things that I mentioned earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali. Can we get this? Yes. The second paper that we have is in this session is the energy transitions in the Arab Gulf states, state capitalism as a driver and a shaper of transition, and it's by Ustaz Faris Sulaiman. He's a research fellow with King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh, and also a PhD candidate at the London School of Economics. So
thanks a lot.
Faris, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Introduction. Yeah, I'm pleased to be here, and I think it's an interesting pairing of papers. Me and Mu'izz, we zoomed in a little bit on Qatar, and now I'm going to zoom out. I'm a political economist by background. I study institutions, and so it's going to be a little bit different than some of the sessions we've seen even yesterday. And it's part of a broader project that I'll kind of touch on. It is strange to be talking about energy transitions and problems in the future when such extreme situation is happening in Palestine. So I think it's important that we recognize that and we show solidarity as well. So I'll start by saying that I'll give some research context to what I'm, this is part of a broader project, or series of papers organized by SIPA in Princeton, myself and a few colleagues at the Grantham Institute at the LSE. And that context kind of emerged. Yeah, it's not working at the moment. There we go. So that context emerged from a 2019 OECD paper. That OECD paper looked at the role of state capital in the energy transitions of G20 and OECD countries and found a positive correlation between state investment in the power sector and pace of energy transition, which all of us found quite strange. We didn't really understand it. There wasn't much theoretical explanation for what may be taking place. And as you see on the chart that I kind of just briefly put in front of you here, on the y-axis, we have the non-hydro share of renewables. So how much renewables they have on the grid as a share of capacity. And we have a range of kind of traditionally state capitalist countries. So you see Vietnam surging ahead, China doing particularly well, but you see the Gulf states there at the bottom. I've added kind of 2 more years of data to show that things have picked up in the UAE and Saudi. But by and large, they're low performers on pace of energy transition when you look at them in the global context. So really, if we're going to talk about the role of state capital in energy transitions, we have a mixed bag. It's not always the case that state capital in the power sector or in renewable energy leads to a fast energy transition. Rather, there must be some other mixture of institutions that leads to that outcome. So this is part of a broader project that I'm also doing as part of my PhD, where I look at sovereign wealth funds turning inwards. So we've gathered basically the largest data set of all state-owned companies in the Gulf states. There are hundreds of them. They are in a range of different activities. And this may look like a confusing chart, but just to explain it briefly, this looks at new state-owned companies that have been founded in the UAE over the last 12 or 13 years, so categorized as new type state-owned companies. And this is the ISIC categories. Each number represents an ISIC category. So we see hundreds of new state-owned companies in a range of sectors. And this is singular, actually. The only places where you see this kind of change in the world are in the Gulf states, particularly in the UAE and Saudi, where you see dozens of new state-owned companies being launched in a range of different sectors. And this is changing kind of reform outcomes. And we're really about studying how does this affect a range of different development and reform outcomes. Today, this paper is looking at the energy transition. So if you launch a bunch of state-owned companies in kind of energy transition related industries, does it change either the pace or the quality of the energy transition? So there are 2 kind of questions. The one is the paper that I've submitted here today, and that's asking a kind of broad question of, we have this natural experiment. We have some Gulf states that are progressing along their energy transition and some that are not. So why do we see a divergence in pace? Us kind of political scientists are really interested in these kind of natural experiments. The Gulf states share a lot of socioeconomic characteristics. And so it's an interesting way to kind of understand, well, it might seem obvious, but why do we see a divergence? And why did they as a group start late? That also might seem obvious, but really nothing had been written in the literature about the mechanisms through which this kind of rentier effect took place. And the second project, which is underway, is how do these new forms of state capitalism, particularly present in the UAE and Saudi, how do they affect the pace of the transition? What is the mechanism for that? And do they lead to successful green industrial policy? So just taking a step back and looking at the puzzle, obviously, I think people who kind of woke up yesterday and saw the UAE, decide to host COP28 or see the Saudi Green Initiative, they find this quite a surprising or shocking turn of events, seeing as the Gulf states played kind of a variety of different roles in early climate discourse, but were obstructive at some period of time, have moved to kind of a more constructive, and now are aspiring leaders in that space. So this is kind of a strange turn of events that needs, I think, some explanation and some inquiry. Obviously, the Gulf states had interest and aspirations earlier on. They have a lot of spending in R&D, institutions like KAUST, KCARE, Masdar City, and IRENA. Some people have touched on this, IRENA being hosted, in Abu Dhabi, but also mergers and acquisitions interest by Aramco, by PDO, by other players in the region. So there was some interest, but the underlying political economies of these states up until about 2014 and the oil price decline in 2014 didn't really change. So we didn't have kind of domestic transitions take place till significantly later. What we do see, though, is as a group, despite the progress that's been made, we can easily compare them with another regional country, another sunny monarchy in Jordan, and we see a pretty big difference in the pace of transition. We see Jordan at about 45% of solar and wind as its share of total capacity, and we see the UAE kind of creeping up to 12, 13%. Saudi and Oman are both having this kind of hockey stick moment, so we expect things to improve quite dramatically in the next few years, but still there's a long way to go. So I think this deserves a little bit of explanation. And the kind of argument we make here is that there's a double rentier effect taking place. So I'll talk about this double rentier effect. One is at the kind of utility scale, and one is at the distributed rooftop scale. So at the utility scale, means these kind of large projects like the first image you see, built in the middle of the desert, often by state-owned firms, and there's a different logic to that for that when compared with kind of distributed rooftop solar, which are consumers responding to subsidized energy prices and then engaging in kind of renewables development. So at the centralized utility scale, and this ties into some of the papers that were discussed yesterday about the opportunity cost of oil sales, what we see is in an atmosphere of fiscal abundance. So when states are doing well, when the oil price is high, we don't see a lot of renewable energy development. And this is the evidence is clear on that. So prior to 2014, maybe between 2010 and 2014, when states might have conceivably began the energy transition like Jordan or other countries, there we had an atmosphere of fiscal abundance, and the states are essentially not counting the dollars and cents. So in that atmosphere, they don't engage in renewable energy development. That's interesting because it's the exact opposite of the rest of the world, right? In the rest of the world, when we find the oil price to be high, states tend to consumers of oil and gas tend to look for alternatives and invest more renewables during those periods of high oil prices. This changed in 2014, like I said, when we had an oil price decline from historic highs. But really, the first few years between 2014 and 2018 had unresolved questions of market design and rent capture. What I mean by that is it wasn't clear in Saudi to a certain extent and in UAE who was set to benefit from the energy transition. How was the state going to be involved? Which institutions were going to play a role? And these kind of questions of market design were not resolved at that time. At the distributed scale, we have obviously a range of subsidized domestic energy markets which provide infertile ground for renewable energy development. So solar PV in the case of Saudi or the UAE or Oman has to compete directly on a levelized cost basis with energy that's being provided from the grid. We had some energy subsidy reform in kind of the deficit panic years of 2014 to 2016, but really that did not continue for much longer. In the UAE, we have We have the highest tariffs along with some special zones in Oman, but by and large, tariffs are still heavily subsidized. And we see that there are client and rent-seeking pressures that keep these domestic energy prices low. And a prime example of that is the industrial tariff in Saudi, which remains at 18 halala or $4.50. And recently, in order to attract export-oriented businesses, they have introduced a new heavy consumption tariff, which is at 12 halala. So energy prices are actually going down in some respect. So this is a brief explanation of some of the mechanisms that we see that explain why we saw this late start. So despite what I've just said, what we see definitively now is that states in the region are picking up development. We kind of mentioned this yesterday, but in red we have total capacity installed. So we have about 2 gigawatts in Saudi, a little less, and 2 or 3 in the UAE. But interestingly, on the kind of the gray part of the chart is total credible plans, and by credible plans, these are projects that we tracked as a part of the Global Energy Monitor, and that I track myself. And these are projects that have been awarded, have reached financial close, and are in construction. So you can see that there's a doubling of capacity expected in Saudi just in the next 18 months compared to all that's ever been installed. So we're at an interesting inflection point, both in the case of Saudi, the UAE, and to a lesser extent, Oman. And these projects are mostly being developed through independent power producing tenders, and they're mostly won by Gulf state-owned companies. If some of you attended the session yesterday, I talked a little bit about how Aqua and Masdar represent probably around 85% of all the capacity that's been installed in the Gulf. Green hydrogen opportunities in Saudi and the UAE and Oman are big drivers of growth. And most of this is solar PV, with one wind project being built in Domat al-Jandal in Saudi and another being planned in Oman. Interestingly, though, we see a slower progress in Bahrain, in Kuwait, and Qatar with even more modest goals. And that's kind of an interesting thing. We see a mixture of high and low rent countries within the group. So if we said initially, okay, rents explain the late start as a group, the logic would then follow that, you know, the most rentier countries, the ones that are most comfortable, like maybe the UAE or Qatar, would be the slowest. But the logic doesn't continue, and that's kind of what I find interesting. So among the GCC states, the super rentier countries are usually referred to kind of in the political science literature, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait. We find the UAE as a super rent country and Saudi as a middle rent country have developed the most renewables and have the most ambitious and credible plans. And we run through a few different hypotheses from the literature to say why that might be the case. The case that's given by the states is that really this is not a race. It's a marathon. We are or a long-term kind of race. We were always waiting for a better bargain. We wanted levelized costs at around kind of $2 something like that. And that's why we've only now decided to engage in renewables. Another is that we have these client and rent-seeking pressures, which have weakened in some states. This is a state autonomy argument. This is broadly a kind of political science argument that says that after the Arab Spring, some states in the region were able to kind of break away from their political and social contracts that they had before, and were able to change kind of some of these social contracts in a way that allowed them to move more freely, set up new state-owned companies, and behave differently in the kind of domestic economic landscapes. Another one is kind of often discussed abroad, not so much here, is this idea of soft power projection or greenwashing, the idea that they're only doing it for a climate change narrative, that Saudi and the UAE are rising middle powers, and that in order to play at that table, have a seat at that table, they have to engage in this kind of energy transition. Another one, obviously, is that the UAE just started and Saudi is a competitor, and so it decided to do it right after. I'm convinced by some of the client and rent-seeking arguments. Economic competition is somewhat reasonable, but I think most of my research points to this idea that really when you have sovereign wealth funds that turn inwards, and begin investing and endowing independent renewable energy developers, that's really what separates the UAE and Saudi from the other states in the region. In the case of the UAE, you have Mubadala and now ADQ and ADNOC being major shareholders in Masdar, which is a global renewable energy company, probably one of the largest owners of renewable energy assets in the world. And Aqua Power is the same in Saudi Arabia. The PIF took a controlling stake there after a series of investments in 2021. So what we see So what we see is these two states have these domestically focused sovereign wealth funds launching hundreds of SOEs, particularly in renewable energy development, in green hydrogen, in EV manufacturing, and in renewable energy component manufacturing. And so we see state capital being mobilized quickly to meet these priorities. But we do not see a regulatory environment and private sector being involved in this kind of progress. This is definitely a state capitalist-driven process. And in other GCC countries, by contrast, we see a landscape where the national oil companies were given renewable energy development mandates. There are no new and independent state-owned companies that are kind of shaping both the goals and the ability of the states to meet those goals. So they're both state capitalist in some ways, but one is a kind of more, we call it a new type state capitalist economy, where we have these new state-owned entities that are financialized, globalized, and competing against each other. So finally, just to describe this briefly, we see this national champion strategy. I think economic competition is definitively a factor, but also I think there's interesting cooperation between different state capitalist economies. So the Silk Road Fund, which is a Chinese state-owned fund, is the largest shareholder in ACWA's portfolio company. So it owns 49% of all the renewable energy projects held by ACWA, and they are, for example, they're set to own about 30% of all the generation capacity in Uzbekistan by 2024. Uzbekistan was a country Saudi had very little political or economic relationships with before the collapse of the Soviet Union, even in the last 10 to 15 years, and have quickly used kind of renewable energy development to do that. So really the state is positioning itself at various points in the renewable energy value chain, not just in development, but in component manufacturing and green hydrogen export. I've kind of broken down one project here to have an idea of what this looks like, but maybe I'll leave that for the Q&A if you're interested.
Thank you so much, Ustaz Faris. Both were very, very interesting discussions. We'll get the other presentations up and running, but first we're going to have a discussion and a bit of Q&A. So two very, very interesting papers. For Professor Ali, I really like the idea. The approach is really interesting because it's really a fundamental approach in economics where you're trying to develop a counterfactual essentially, and then unpack that. And I think that's the strength of the exercise, and then use that to do projections into the future. The question I had regarding counterfactual becomes to what extent you've captured everything in the world without LNG. One example for, I don't know how big a drop in the pool this is, but one example is without LNG, Qatar also wouldn't have had let's say the wealth to build up and effectively expand its own use of LNG. So that you might end up with less anyway, which I don't think was incorporated into the model, but it's something worth considering as well, because that's part of the whole counterfactual scenario that you need to build. The other question I found myself asking is what, in terms of a wider lens, the big argument is LNG is a transitional fuel. And how long will this last? I found myself asking this. It's an argument Qatar is making, and it's being made in the presentation, that how long do we expect in the future? And you've suggested it there, but maybe giving us an idea would be great. Ustaz Faris, first of all, thank you so much for mentioning Palestine. I think it's weighing on all our minds. Even though the subject matter of this conference is very heavy and serious, it's actually for me personally been a mental break. To come into the conference, because the rest of the time has been really following the news and thinking what's happening there. So you're absolutely right. Our thoughts and prayers are with the people of Gaza and Palestine. In terms of your presentation, I really like the approach in terms of looking at especially these new state-owned companies and unpacking them and creating this database, which I think is a building block for an entire research agenda, which I think is what you have in mind. And this is just one component. So hopefully you can continue expanding that. I like the argument that you made. The idea of a double rentier effect also very conceptually appealing in this context. And as well as the idea of how sovereign wealth funds will turn inwards. And again, I'm sure Dr. Ibrahim Badawi sitting to your right is going to want to talk to you about how you can develop your research agenda further under ERF. So thank you so much for a very rich presentation. I'd just like to open the floor for questions. Introduce yourselves briefly, please, in case they don't know you. Thank you.
أعمال عبيد لدراسات. A question and a remark for Dr. Ali. First of all, there was an NBER paper that came out about a month ago, or maybe 6 weeks ago, by Dara Najamolu and Lint Baraj, and I can't remember them being a third author. And it was basically looking at the counterfactual effect of shale gas development in the US. And it's a similar general approach to what you're doing, saying that looking at the effect of what is the effect of the discovery of shale gas on emissions in the US, and they develop a very quite rich structural model, and their actual conclusion is that the shale gas has been negative under the plausible parameter values because they incorporate directed technical change into their model. And so what they say is what happens is because shale gas has decreased the price of energy prices in the US in the near term, this has led to less R&D in terms of green energies and less allocation of resources to developing better green technologies. And so that even though in the short run there's lower emissions because of gas is cleaner than coal, in the long run it will lead to higher accumulated emissions because the technological progress in the green sector will be slower than when it would have been under the counterfactual of not discovering shale gas. So maybe you want to have a look at that paper and see if there's anything from their model of technology, because it's not a very complicated model, and it's one that is designed to be parameterized. The question I had for you is, why did you do this for Qatar? I mean, for me, would have made sense to look at the counterfactual effect of LNG, not specific to any political entity. I know at the end you mentioned that you could use it for policy analysis in the sense that Qatar in the future would want to, as coal decreases usage, then it would have to recalibrate. But it's not as if anyone in the world holds Qatar accountable for its emissions by conducting a counterfactual exercise like the one you're doing. They'll say how much is Qatar emitting, and they won't give Qatar credit for its LNG decreasing somebody else's coal usage, whether that's true or not. So I'm wondering why you specifically picked Qatar rather than LNG in general in the market. Thank you.
3 questions, and then Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you. Yes, I actually concur with you, Nader, that we are being treated to a new generation of very impressive economists and or let us say scientists, because this is now we are moving into an era of multidisciplinary approaches. I know Mu'izz is originally an engineer, and then he did his PhD on energy economics, and so this is really very interesting and quite. I have actually one question to each of the 2 presenters. For Mu'izz, I don't know, I may be wrong, but what I hear today from Dr. Adil is that the technology is moving in divergent directions. So assuming, out of my ignorance, but I'm just assuming that actually the carbon capture of LNG could actually be even more enhanced. So it would be quite interesting, I think, because you didn't give us an idea about, for the interest of time, the structure of the model itself. So to the extent that this model can be more structured, where you can actually build a counterfactual based on Qatar, and not only Qatar, but I think as Dr. Omar is saying, there is an heavy, there is an investment on LNG that actually increased the carbon capture relative to what is existing now. So then you have actually, in my opinion, a much more policy relevant scenario built on this counterfactual. That what would have happened should Qatar, for example, invest heavily as a main exporter of LNG on the new technologies, and maybe tracing the potential impact of the new technologies on the carbon emissions relative to LNG itself, as well as relative to coal or so on. So that might be one thing that you might want to think about. As for Dr. Faris, I think I'll very quickly tell a story that the global sales manager of Toyota came to Dubai. And at that time, I was working at the Dubai Economic Council. And we hosted him and we suggested the proposal that Qatar is really second to none in terms of the business environment and so on. And we would like, Toyota to think about building an an auto industry in Qatar, in Dubai, so that Dubai can become a hub for, And he said, in terms of the demand, you are talking to a converted. Dubai is really second to none. But on the supply, you have a problem. So we asked him about what did he mean by supply? He said that they recently built a factory in Thailand, and they actually procured very sophisticated inputs from high technology SMEs in Bangkok and other around surroundings in Thailand, because that is the only way for this industry to become competitive, is actually you outsource. And so from the supply side, you don't have that capacity. You don't have engineering schools, you don't have technologies, you don't have laboratories, and therefore SMEs that is at high tech in Dubai, and I'm sure also in the entire GCC. So the transition to renewable energy by this state capitalism could actually, if the political economy and the priorities are aligned, could actually also provide another benefit, because the non-renewable energy has been associated with these big conglomerate companies, which does not create wide opportunities for employment and for entrepreneurship and so on. Is there any possibility that actually the transition to renewable energy will also be associated with empowering and providing opportunities for high-tech SMEs that will engage young entrepreneurs and skilled engineers and technology and accountants and what have you from all of these skills? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Chris has a question. You want to take it from there, or?
See if everybody can hear me then. Good. So thanks a lot for the presentation. As always, I learn a lot, and I'm really
respond to questions and wrap up, please. Thank you.
So I'll try to get through these as quickly as possible. So the reason I studied Qatar, I mean, A, it's my remit, and B, I thought it was interesting that most of its exports go to Asian markets. So the LNG exports to Europe only increased significantly recently, but before that it was, a small percentage to the UK, which gets its gas from the North Sea or from Norway, etc., and a small percentage also in Spain, and then, but the biggest chunk was going to Asia, and Asia is a very is dominated by industry, and industry is a massive consumer of coal still, and it seems like it's going to be persistent over the next couple of years. And thank you for the paper recommendation. I will look it up. To Christian's question, I think so our analysis is limited to 2020 because of data availability, but I think maybe next year we might be able to get data up to 2022, and perhaps we can incorporate the war in Ukraine. Sorry, Dr. Ibrahim, I forgot your question.
Sorry, I was just asking about the extent to which you might be able to build a counterfactual based on Qatar investing in new technologies that will even.
Yes, CCUS, right? Okay. So Qatar is actually already implementing carbon capture and storage. It's experimenting with it, and it's part of its commitment to decarbonize the LNG production supply chain. But yeah, so we're hoping to kind of build out this model in more detail, probably expand it with a longer time frame, and potentially looking at other countries, look at LNG globally if possible. But I do know that other people are looking at this. So yeah, so thank you all for the questions.
I'll also be brief, Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think one of the points I've been trying to make with the research agenda more broadly is that the energy transition does not necessarily happen in parallel to other structural change. The kind of structural change that is that's taking place in the Gulf, I think particularly in the UAE and Saudi, is a shift from a more traditional rentier economy to a more state capitalist economy that we can compare and de-exceptionalize with other state capitalist economies globally. That is the major kind of underlying political and structural shift that has taken place, and it's in this context that the energy transition is taking place. So the energy transition in itself does not have within it kind of the power to change these kind of deep-seated economic structures. And I think what you find is that as with other industries, the energy transition is a very state-dominated affair, both in the UAE and in Saudi. There is little room. I mean, I don't mean to be pessimistic, because there are some positive aspects to a state-driven energy transition. For the first being the pace. The second being the degree to which you can build national champions, which can go and compete abroad. And now Aqua and Masdar are winning tenders in Chile, in Uzbekistan, in Central Asia, and in Africa. So there's definitely, we should call it what it is. It's a state-driven process. It has its pros and its cons, and I think we should study it as it is. I think there is reason to believe that there will be benefits for a much more kind of diverse ecosystem. So when the PIF does sign with Foxconn or recently Hyundai to build, EV manufacturing on the West Coast. We don't necessarily have that ecosystem that can support that manufacturing process, but it's still early days. I think it will take time for these investments to reach maturity, and we can hope that there is an ecosystem that's built at kind of the mid stage of this transition. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ustaz Faris. Thank you, Dr. Muaz, for a rich discussion. And we need to move on. Okay, I can't say no.
Quick question to Faris. Thank you very much for the presentation. Are there differences between the Gulf countries when it comes to the state capitalism in the energy transition? Like, is Oman different?
There are some interesting differences emerging now. The biggest of which is that, for example, in the UAE, traditionally ADNOC was not a major player in the energy transition companies, let's say. But there's been a reshuffling of kind of the state capitalist landscape in the UAE. A new player has emerged in ADQ, which is a new sovereign wealth fund established in the last 3 years in Abu Dhabi with new leadership. And ADNOC has now been inserted as an equity holder in several of the major kind of renewable energy or transition companies, including through Taqa owning in Barak, the nuclear power plant. So we do see some changes taking place in the UAE, but we definitively see that the UAE and Saudi are building their own model, which is a national champions model. And Oman, by contrast, is making substantial progress when compared to the other states, but it's driven by foreign capital. So they're mostly investments from Saudi and Aqua Power and from Kuwait. And so that's kind of a slightly different model where you have kind of regional cooperation more present.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to double check with, well, first of all, thank you very much, and thank you for keeping to time. I'll check with Yasmin. We start 15 minutes late, we can go 15 minutes more. So we're right on time. Thank you. So the next session this panel is looking at energy transition and finance. And again, we have two excellent papers. The first one, Dr. Saadi from the Department of Econometrics at University Manouba, Tunis, on causality between financial development and sectoral carbon emissions. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you for the ERF staff and KAPSARC for this valuable event, and to give us the opportunity to improve our first draft for the paper entitled "Causality between Finance Development and Sector Carbon Emission: Evidence from GCC economy. The outline of my presentation is as follows, beginning with motivation, research problem, and we finish with conclusion and policy. Our motivation is in two ways. Here we have, from one hand, sustainable economic activity, and we look after a higher revenue for this part of the globe, and this region is with abundant liquidity, has stimulated the greater growth and boosted financial sector. And from the other hand, this financial development in this GCC country comparable to the emerging, we have also some environmental issue for this region is great because they are the most pollution per capita for the globe. In average, GCC country per capita pollute 4 to 8 times more than the world per capita. So this reason, the reducing emission, it will be very interesting in this region than other. Our research problem here is to look after if financial development have a relationship causes the quality of environment, and if this relation exists, which sector can most influence the financial development and influenced by the financial development. And if so, if we catch this part of financial development who can reduce CO2 emission, so how can the policymaker reduce and to influence the CO2 emission by using parts or financial development policy? So our research topic is to investigate this relationship between from one hand financial development indicator and its key dimension, and on the other hand CO2 emission per capita and its principal sector for the region. For the literature review, we don't have any, is not conclusive, and from the vast and rich literature that is interesting in this subject, we don't have a conclusive thing for this relationship, and we can divide the existing literature in 3 strands. By their findings. For the first strand, they have conduct that the empirical result have a bilateral relationship between CO2 and financial development, and for the second strand, we have just one way from this relationship, and from the third strand is they don't find any empirical relationship between the causality between financial development and CO2 emission. And all of this literature have tested this relationship using, I think, and this is why we are interested in the subject, using a simple causality, granular causality, and this bilateral causality, and using also the panel data. And I think with my co-author that don't taking into account this heterogeneity between a group make a non-adequate conclusion. And for this reason, we propose an empirical methodology based on CONIA 2006. The CONIA 2006, it's more appropriate for taking into account the heterogeneity between the group, and give us the granular causality test by bootstrapping and by correcting this presence of heterogeneity, and give us, I think, the right and the correct relationship between the two variables, the two target variables. So here our data, it's for all GCC country, and just I will choose Saudi Arabia just for emission by sector. And here we have two principal data: the COD per capita and its component from five principal sector: building, other industry and conversion, other sector, power industry, and transport. And we from our research is tackling from the data from 1980 to 2021. And from the second hand, we have the data proposed and defined by the EMF for which develop for 180 country some financial development indicator based on the six proposed sub indexes, which is for the financial market in depth, access, and efficiency, and also for the financial institution depth, access, and institution. And here we can find which kind of financial development can be rely our target to and to be target to develop to influence CO2 emission. For our results, so we have that none of the financial, so we don't find any relationship between CO2 emission to the financial development, so except for Bahrain and Kuwait, and for the all region we can find 21 relationship that we have this relationship that the financial development affect, and here when we say affects, so can't react and to CO2 emission. And here we include the effect, the positive and the negative effect, because here the relationship can be positive and it's not, and also it's negative. I think it's it's not the updated presentation. It's the old one. Sorry for. I have sent it this morning. Because so I will try to continue to save time. So here relationship exists for some sector, and this relationship.
Looks like we got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. 10. Number 10.
Slide 10.
Okay. Yeah. So this one. So now. For the sector relationship between financial development and the five proposed sector, we can see that which part of the financial development can affect CO2 and in which sector. So here our conclusion, so that the higher level of carbon emission in both power industry and other sector, which are the two main polluter sector in the region, has promoted in UAE and Kuwait to develop their financial sector in order to improve technology. So, and regarding the direction of causality for the financial development and CO2 emission sector, our test reject the So give us that the relationship, we have 12 relationship over 36 possible relationship. So our recommendation for policymaker, it's just it's depend on the target for each one. It's for the short run or for the long run, because the relationship is can be varied. And if they have, for example, to develop and to reduce immediately, they can find where the relationship is negative. And if we increase this part of financial development index proposed by EMF, so we will reduce this part or a part of CO2 emission in each sector. Here we have some results. So I collect some results. We see that the financial development here have just a negative. It's always significant for all the country, but it's negative for just for Bahrain and United Arab in the Emirates United Arab. So here we propose that these two country, we find that the financial development is well developed, and their CO2 per capita have a saturation. And if we increase financial development in the whole, so this increasing in financial development will be reduce CO2 per capita emission in these two countries. For the rest, we have a positive effect. So what does mean that so we must continue to develop this these sectors. So and because the relationship is not linear, is non-linear, and in the future, so after developing, so we can see that we will reduce we will have an increase in the first few years, and after that, this increase will be get a decreasing path. For the financial development to power to specific power industry, which is relying on in this region. So we can find that the financial development have a negative effect. Have a negative effect for Saudi Arabia and Emirates, which have that their power industry it's relying on the higher technology, and this one is saturated. So any supplementary effort for the financial development will reduce the part of this industry to the total emission in this two country. And for the third chosen table, so here we have the specific part of the financial development. Here we have chosen the financial institution efficiency, and which it's a reaction between this part of financial institution efficiency to the CO2 per capita. And we find that for Qatar and for Saudi Arabia, increasing efficiency in these two countries can reduce the CO2 emission. Conclusion, so here GCC country must consider heterogeneous impact of the financial development on CO2 emission, and for each we don't find any common policymaker recommendation for all the country. It's depend on the specificity of each one to for their sector and for their financial development development index for this country. And our paper have the novelty for and increase the existing literature in twofold. First of all, we are, as I acknowledge, that the first paper who chose this adapted panel Granger causality using bootstrap technique to develop to correct the relationship between CO2 and emission and financial development. And for the second, we are the first also to include which sector are sensitive to this financial development. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Saadi. Finally, we have Professor Ahmad Sayed with the Department of Economics and Finance at the United Arab Emirates University. And the okay. And the topic is the impact of fintech and blockchain technology on UAE's financial sector. Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here and present my my work. Also, I would like to thank ERF and KAPSARC for hosting the conference. All presentation has been very well qualified, and we heard a lot of interesting discussion. My presentation actually based on the impact and the relationship of fintech technology on stability of UAE financial sector. So thank you. So I'm actually moving on the same direction with the previous presentation, which looking at the impact of financial development on CO2 emission and energy transition. And we all know that is one of the critical issues facing energy transition and climate change is actually channeling enough finance in order to tackle the climate change issues. And we have seen this in many conferences, in international meetings by the IMF, by the United Nations, and many other international institutions highlighted the importance of having enough capital and financial resources to be able to tackle energy transition. So one of the key challenges actually we are facing is also in order to be able to channel enough capital into energy transition, we would need to have a stable and efficient financial market, so we will be able to achieve these targets. And from the other hand, we have currently over the last few years we have been facing another challenge, which simply speaking is the advances in technology, technological advances, and how this is actually disrupting and impacting financial market worldwide and increasing the volatility of those market and risk transmission. So this is just a very brief background about the motivation of this presentation and the topic under consideration. So technically, I will start with just a very brief introduction about the topic, moving on to the literature, data analysis, construction of the financial stress index, very briefly discussing results, and ending up with a conclusion. So the work we are doing now is actually extended some of the previous work we have been interested in. So over the last few years, we've been interested in financial market volatility and stability in the MENA region. And this is actually started in 2017 with a preliminary paper on the impact of Arab Spring on stability of financial market in MENA, which is published in GFMIM journal. And this is also followed by another paper in 2020 with a couple of my colleagues indicating and examining the pattern of risk connectedness among MENA country. And again, we have another paper to look at the impact of oil shocks on financial stability in oil-rich country such as the GCC economies. So starting from this, again, we have seen that is, again, yes, there is another challenge that is actually facing a financial market in the MENA region, which actually based on technological advances that we have seen over the last few years, right, including blockchain technology, decentralized finance, CBDC and central bank digital currency introduction. All this innovation has disrupted financial financial market and has actually increased the risk transmission and the volatility on those markets. So this is actually what the main motivation for studying the impact of fintech on stability of our financial markets. And there is no doubt that is financial technological advances and fintech industry has some positive impact on the financial market, including ease of capital movement across border, reduction of financial transaction, reducing information asymmetry, and also uncovering new opportunities for investments. But from the other hand, as we mentioned, it also have some negative consequences, including higher connectedness, which again mean it will be higher financial volatility and contagion, higher financial markets exposure and risk exposure, and as a result, this will undermine the stability of those markets. Looking at, in particular, narrowing down, so this was just of the some of the pros and cons of fintech industry and its impact on the global financial market. But narrowing down our focus on the MENA country, we have seen that is alright. Some of the MENA countries actually started to engage with fintech industry and taking advantage of those technological advances. Such as the United Arab Emirates, we have some initiatives in Morocco, in Turkey, in Egypt as well, right? But actually, United Arab Emirates has a clear forefront position in this regard, and they are doing a lot of efforts. Too many initiatives has been actually started over the last 3-4 years, actually pushing forward to take advantage of technological advances and the fintech industry. Going back, starting in 2017, they started with the Emirates blockchain strategy. In April 2018, also Abu Dhabi International Financial Center and global markets in Abu Dhabi, started a lot of legislation initiative to encourage startup fintech. And as a result, you will see that is UAE now hosting the highest number of fintech startups in the MENA region, accounting for 67 startups, followed by 44 in Turkey and 30 in Jordan and Lebanon. So we will see that is UAE actually making a lot of efforts, a lot of progress in terms of positioning the UAE financial markets at the main capital hub and the main financial market for the MENA region. And as we have seen, they have initiated a lot of initiative legislation. But despite this importance and the initiative and the effort that has been done, right, there is no previous, in the literature, there is no previous paper or study that actually looked at the impact of fintech on stability of the financial market in the MENA region, and in particular, the United Arab Emirates. And this is where we have the motivation to start looking at this topic. What we have seen a very few studies actually looking at the impact of fintech on different segments of the financial system. So we have one paper looking at the impact of fintech on banking, another paper looking at the impact of fintech on the stock markets or the bond markets. But actually, all those papers, they are very, very few, as you can see, but also the suffering from a major deficiency of just looking at the problem from just one angle or from one segment. They don't have this holistic overview of the impact of fintech industry on the whole financial system and the stability of the financial markets. So By looking into this, all right, our paper tried to achieve three main objectives and also filling those gaps in the literature. So first, we are trying to examine the dynamic relationship between fintech and financial instability in the UAE, investigating risk connectedness and risk transmission between the two, and also looking and shedding some more lights on the pattern of risk connectedness under extreme market condition, such as the risk transmission during the COVID-19 period, what's happening during market stress. So in order to achieve our goals, we start to collecting some of the data. So we're using a daily data for the Global FinTech Index as a proxy of the FinTech industry. Also, we constructed a composite financial stress index for the UAE financial sector. And this takes into account different segments from the market. I will talk more about this in the next slides, how we constructed the index and what are the component and the variables. Also, beside these two main variables of interest, we also included the volatility index, VIX. We also included the oil market volatility and the geopolitical risk index to account for the financial market, the global market and financial market volatility. Also, because of UAE Arab Emirates is one of the rich oil countries, so we also included oil volatility to account for this impact on the stability of the financial market, but also we included geopolitical risk index to account for the geopolitical challenges that we are facing now, and it's become like the norm, right? From time to time now we have different geopolitical challenges that is actually emerging in our global market, and it's become like something that we have to deal with. So those are the three variables we already included to account for or to control for the global environments. So the data is being collected from data stream, and it's ranging from June 2023 to June 20, this should be from June 2012 to June 2023. Now, coming back to the idea of constructing a holistic composite financial stress index for the company, right? For the United Arab Emirates country, right? This is actually a very well established technique in the literature, where we are including several segments, including several indicators for several segments of the financial market. So we included three proxy from the banking sector. We have the cap and beta for the banking industry, the negative banking return, also the banking volatility estimated from Armagarsh models. Also, we included some proxies from the equity market, bond market, and the foreign exchange market. So you will see, all right, we got to try to include as much as possible to have representation from each segment of the financial market and the financial system within the UAE industry. In order to be able to analyze the risk transmission and the volatility between the variable under consideration, right, we adopted the time varying parameter vector autoregressive model. This is a new model that actually been developed by Diebold and Yilmaz in 2012-2014, and the model is very well established in academia, which simply speaking, based on a VAR model from a variance decomposition from the variance error decomposition function. Which allow you to see the impulse response for different shocks. And this approach actually has been developed further in 2019 and 2018. All right, so from a VAR model into a time varying parameter. So this will add more advantage because simply speaking, we don't need to use arbitrary rolling window to see the dynamics, but also it will be not very sensitive to the outlier in our, because simply speaking, we are dealing with financial data, and outlier is a key inherited characteristic of our data. So this is simply speaking just a graph of our original data set, and the first top graph on the left hand side is simply speaking the composite financial stress index, and as you can see, it's quite representative for the condition of the financial market in the UAE country. We will see a bit of jump in 2014, 2015 because of the collapse of oil market. Also, another small jump in 2017 because of the political conflict with Qatar country. Another extreme jump in March 2020 because of the COVID-19 crisis, and then the settling down back to the normal levels. Again, some descriptive statistics to indicate that those variable is actually stationary, and as a result, we will be able to apply the VAR analysis. Now, looking at the variance decomposition function from the TVP VAR model, which actually could be interpreted as a spillover matrix. So you will see that in the column actually introducing how much shocks has been introduced or transmitted from each of the market to the other markets. So columns will be like shock transmitted to other markets. But if you look at the rows, this will be the opposite. So simply speaking, this is how much shock has been received right from other markets. Due to limited time, so I have to move on. But here you will see that is clearly that is financial stress is actually has a net spillover of minus 1.6. So it's actually receiving shocks from the other market, where actually global fintech industry has a positive. It's mean that it's transmitting shocks to this market as well as the VIX index. Simply speaking, this is a connectedness pattern. It's actually based on the connectedness table, but actually we put it in a nice pattern. It's actually to be easy to comprehend and understand, and you will be able to get the clear picture of the transmission mechanism. This is simply speaking the dynamics. So using the TV part, the time varying parameter techniques, we will be able to estimate the dynamics of the spillover across those markets. And again, you will see that there is a very huge spike in 2014-15 because of global financial crisis. Another spike again during the COVID-19 period. Again, this is in order to be able to get a clear picture. We looked at the net spillover dynamics again, so I'm going to skip this. Just one final points to make, that is it's also quite important given the risk and the external shock that we are facing from time to time. That is, financial market is not always as normal. It has some period of high volatility because of external shock like the COVID-19 or the Russian-Ukraine crisis. So it's always interesting to see how the market will be react under extreme market condition, and that's why we use the quantile VAR model to estimate again the spillover. And so this is simple speaking. Again, you will be able to see the network connectedness under the extreme quantile, so under the lower quantile and the upper quantile. So I'm just moving on to the conclusion because I believe I'm over the time. So you will see that is all right from this very brief analysis that is UAE financial market is actually well integrated with the global financial markets. You will see that is all right. It has volatility transmission from the VIX, from the global financial market, but also from fintech industry. So the main source of risk transmission to the UAE financial market is coming from the VIX and coming from fintech, because simply speaking, it is very well connected. And we have seen this because simply UAE has taken a major steps in order to be fully integrated with the global financial market and position their market as the main hub for the capital movement in the MENA region. Also, we have seen a high shift in the role of oil market and how oil can affecting stability of the financial market. Before the COVID, it was a net receiver of shock, but after the COVID-19, it turning out to be a main risk transmission for the UAE financial sector. So by this, I would like to thank you so much, and back to our chair.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, very much. We had two very rich, dense papers econometrically, and I think that's my main takeaway. They're very dense. What I'd like to have seen probably in the first paper, or was struggling with, was kind of more the theoretical model or conceptual framework. Even in the paper, the theoretical model is basically listing various papers that are looking at the different causality directions. But the question becomes, what's the drive? How is this working? How is these working together? How does reducing pollution through financial development policies a clear indicator of the theory of change, so to speak? And this can help with kind of looking at some of the non-linear relationships you had. For example, we know that the issue of these relationships between financial development and looking at some of the CO2 emissions are changing over time, not because of both public interest and because of legislation. So, for example, UAE has reporting requirements now for companies on ESG indicators, and you had the Sustainability Stock Exchange Index, and you had a Global Compact, and so all these things happened in the last 10 years. Now there's a new mandate as well that financial investors actually do invest in some of these industries that are greener. A share has to go there. Qatar is also looking at it has a voluntary system right now, and it's trying to move possibly to more of a legal framework where they're required to. So there's changes taking place over the year that can maybe explain some of this, but you need a very basic conceptual framework to help really us think through these issues. The second paper I liked as well very much. Again, looking at the relationship would have been understanding better the relationship between fintech and stability. Stability would have been helpful because fintech is a very broad term. Some aspects of fintech or some elements of fintech could be more focused on, support stability. Some may be more lead to instability. As somebody who doesn't understand completely all the dynamics of the fintech process, unpacking some of that might be interesting. You know, which elements of fintech, financial innovation are stability inducing, which are not linking up. But I think the results that you had don't necessarily aren't necessarily linked to that observation. So it's morely at this point just an observation to help us unpack things. I was also curious about Bahrain. You mentioned the UAE and Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon, of course, but I also know that Bahrain has tried its best to advance in the fintech space, and they have a fintech hub. And so I was curious. I found myself being curious about what other countries in the region are doing, and whether this was in a systematic review of what's happening or just kind of an observation of a few key countries. So just brief comments, as I'm required to do, because I'm the discussant as well. And before I open up for questions from the floor, we have about a few minutes, so maybe we can have enough time for 2 or 3 questions. Yes, please introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, Fakhri Hassanov, KAPSARC. Actually, I was going to ask 2 questions, but one of them asked by you, so which is about the theory. So I'll ask econometric aspect of the theoretical framework, kind of missing. So I wouldn't worry about the biased estimation, because theoretically CO2 is not only the function of FT, or FT is not only the function of CO2, right? So there are theoretically determined or articulated factors that shape out CO2, like income, like technology, if you come from Stripat framework, or income and its polynomials if you come from EKC framework. So missing them out in causality framework, I don't know, I will concern about the biased causality getting out of it. This A and B, again, econometrically, so you are using the panel data, to my understanding, and you perfectly address the heterogeneity. But we have 3 key issues with panel data, which are heterogeneity, cross-sectional dependency, and non-stationarity. So I couldn't see addressing other 2 issues.
2 minutes each, please. We're standing between participants.
Thanks a lot for these valuable comments. As I told you in the beginning, this is our first draft, and with my two co-authors, we have discussed this fact that, and we are programming in a few days later to introduce the economic growth, and we have this capacity to get three variant from this bootstrapped Granger causality, and I think we can the relationship as theoretically as empirically can be seen in this new essay, and to focus that we have not a direct relationship is, and for this we can rely on the new result, causing that the financial development due to the economic growth can affect CO2 emission, and as I told you, your comment is very useful, and but because we don't have enough time to present our new data and new results. For the second, I think we have another comment about the first is theoretically, and the second one non-stationarity. So for the non-stationarity, so theory are stationary. So we find this, and this is not for the Granger from the Konya. He relied that he used the Shore model, and this Shore model it's outperform traditional model using in literature, and for this reason we take into account heterogeneity and the second and the cross-section antimeters. Thank you. So.
Okay, thank you very much for comments. To back to your remarks, in the beginning, we have started by testing time varying causality. But as said our co-author, Dr. Sahbi, we didn't have enough time series. So we chose to use panel data. If we look at all technicals used in the literature, the best technique is the Konya approach, with a key that called that we can use to, with our data, with our specificity of data. So Konya approach don't need stationarity, tackle the cross-section dependence problem, but his contribution is the heterogeneity. Konya approach can give us the specificities. We use panel data, but in terms of results, we can show difference between countries in terms of results. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chair. Just back to your comments about distangling the total impact of fintech industry into several dimensions. The fintech is a very broad terminology, which simply speaking, it's the implication of technology in financial industry, and it has many diverse. We have seen many innovation in financial market, including P2P, online crowding platform, decentralized finance transaction. But the problem is actually collecting data on those aspects. So I think that it's quite challenging, but I believe that is with time data will be available, and definitely we will be able to dig deep, because yes, this will add more deep understanding of actually what aspects will be adding to the volatility of the financial market and which one will be much more important to consider. The second comment by Christian about the determinant of financial transmission and the risk transmission, this is the work I presented now is still work in progress. Your suggestion is very important, and that will add to our paper. Actually, we have done this in another paper, looking at the determinant of volatility transmission by just using a regression model where we do have the estimation of risk transmission, and we can include some determinant, including the market transaction, the liquidity, the volume, and also some macroeconomic factors. So this will add. But also another dimension we are actually working on at the moment is looking at the impact of fintech on industrial or sectoral level. So we will be able to shed more light on actually what sector is actually more impacted by the technological advances within the UAE country. Thank you so much, and indeed very grateful for your insightful comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the whole panel. Appreciate it. Running 5 minutes late from